Jim was talking about the back and forth nature of American politics, and we've been doing this a little while. I've done this before. I want to do it again, just for people that are thinking, they always seem to think that the election that was most recently held is the end of history, and we've seen it time and time again. I just want to go over this again. In 2004, Republicans won. Karl Rove declared a permanent majority. 2 years later, Nancy Pelosi was elected the first woman Speaker of the House. Democrats took charge. 2008, Barack Obama is elected in the Hope and Change election, and Democrats talk about a permanent, sweeping majority of the ascendant. 2 years later, the Tea Party comes in, and they are in charge. Could not be more different than Barack Obama and all those people who won in 2008. So that was in 2010. 2012, Barack Obama gets reelected. 2014, Republicans take charge of the Senate. 2016, Trump's elected. 2017, Republicans lose. 2018, Republicans lose. 2019, Republicans lose. 2020, Joe Biden elected president. 22, Democrats hold off the red wave. 24, the red wave comes. So there is a back and forth, and this whole idea that this is somehow the end of history, which we heard in 2004 when Bush got reelected. We heard in 2008 when Barack Obama got elected. It's just not. But, Anna, the Democrats have serious problems. There's just not going to come back by gravity. They have serious problems. They lost a great number of Latino voters. They lost a great number of black men. They lost young voters in numbers that they're just is shocking to them that voted for them 2 years ago, 4 years ago. Asian Americans broke away from them. 48 of 50 states broke against Democrats. And some of those states, like I said, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania is moving that way with party registration. If Democrats don't do something fast, Pennsylvania is going to be gone 4 years from now. And the ability to win an election seems even more narrow. What do you think happened a couple of days ago? And where do Democrats need to go over the next 4 years if they want to run a competitive race against the next Republican nominee?
Yeah, it's a difficult week. I think elections are an ancient technology for finding out who your neighbors are, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, right? We have these other polls and other things, but not until you get 100 million plus people driving somewhere, voting, mailing in things, do you actually know who lives around you? And this is not what we've had in recent years, which is a popular vote loss with an electoral college victory the last time Trump won. This is a clear statement of where most people, at least most people who vote, are. And I think it's obviously going to be a moment of reckoning. I don't think we have all the pieces of what needs to change, but I'll say a couple things. I think perhaps the biggest irony of this particular result is that Democrats have worked very hard to build a platform of inclusion. If you look at the actual substance of what they want on issue after issue, it's a very inclusive platform. But I think it reads to a large number of Americans as an elitist, inaccessible party. Now, you can argue that that's ginned up, that's manufactured, but just as an empirical fact, a self-styled inclusive movement reads to a lot of people as elitist. And on the flip side, a movement that is essentially a billionaire special purpose vehicle in the Republican Party has started to read to a lot of people as a working class movement. Again, you can fact check that. I can explain to you all the reasons why that's not true. It doesn't matter, right? The fact that these readings have been reversed is a moment for real reckoning. And I think Democrats have to be a working class party again, both in terms of affect, in terms of real policy vision. Yeah. But I also think there is there is particularly with what happened with men and white voters and now working class voters of color moving in that direction. A real question of, is this a party that when it speaks about issues sounds to people like a broad pan-American movement that strums the deepest chords of the country as opposed to catering to niche interests? And I'm not sure it's there yet, and I think it's going to take, frankly, years. This is not a 1-month autopsy.
No.
I'm not the sports guy at the table, but this is what is called the rebuilding year in sports,
right,
where you know you didn't win the championship this year, and you actually know you're not going to win it next year, and you actually know you're not going to win it the next year after that, and there is a certain freedom in the runway that gives you to say we have to actually reimagine a movement from scratch in many ways.
Sometimes people have to see it. I think there were a lot of warnings. I don't think Democrats were completely, not there. They were trying to warn about the contrast. And I think for a lot of people, it's very hard to comprehend.
Yep.
And they will have to see it to believe it. I want to take a look at New York Times columnist Frank Bruni, who has a new piece entitled Democrats, Let's Get Real, about why Harris lost, and then go to Caddy. He writes in part this: Americans, at least the ones whose minds weren't firmly made up, would surely abandon Trump now. There was a limit to the cruelness and craziness they'd abide. That judgment, of course, was terribly wrong. And I want to name and dwell on a few of the reasons for its wrongness, because they're stubborn, misapprehensions, enduring blind spots. They're costing Democrats, no, they're costing America dearly. For starters, many voters don't know about or didn't really pay attention to all of Trump's florid ugliness in the final hours. Many voters aren't plugged in like that. Politics, even presidential campaigns, aren't in the center of their vision, but in its periphery, and irregularly at that. Those of us who get hourly updates, have nightly freakouts, and can hold forth on Trump and the shark, Trump, and Hannibal Lecter, and Trump and windmills aren't normal. But we are arrogant. We assume our experience is everyone's and our knowledge ambient. No, people are busy. People are distracted. People are cynical. They tune out much, if not most, of this political drama because they regard it indeed as theater, as performance, whether it's Trump's conniptions or Harris's kumbaya. So what then forms their impressions and drives their decisions? They're responding in significant measure to the state of the world around them, whether it's to their liking and whom they hold responsible for it. That was Harris's affliction, the price of food, the elusiveness of home ownership, and the fact that she'd been the number 2 figure in the administration in charge of the country for the past 4 years. The obvious, boring nature of the diagnosis didn't make it any less fatal. Another blind spot, the belief that seemingly key moments matter more than ongoing conditions. Sure, Democrats had an expertly choreographed convention. Yes, Harris had a great debate, no doubt. Trump had a miserable one. And then came his Madison Square Garden debacle. But while treating each of those news stories as potential turning points spiced the narrative, it smudged the big picture, which is about satisfaction with and confidence in the country's direction. Survey after survey showed that Americans were deeply fearful and intensely pessimistic. Not even the most star-studded rally could change that. Not even an endorsement by Taylor Swift could make it go away. Caddy, I think that was searingly correct in many ways. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Frank Bruni is onto something. There was something Kellyanne Conway said back in 2016, which is that voters make a difference between what offends them and what affects them. And many of them may have been offended by Trump's comments. Many of us were offended, but it wasn't what affected them. What affected them was the fact that rents have gone up 30% since COVID, beef is up 45%, milk is up 25%, particularly the rents, because many of us own our homes and we don't feel the shock, the inflation wealth gap that produces. I think the other good piece that's really worth Democrats reading, and it's not to let the party off the hook. It has to go through this post-mortem process, and it has to have a really long, hard think about the kind of leader it puts forward next time. But there's a good piece in the Financial Times today pointing out that of all the big elections that have taken place around this world this year, the 10 incumbent leaders of the major economies that voted this year, they were all thrown out of the office. And that's the first time in 120 years that happened. There's a post-COVID shock to the world, particularly on the issue of inflation, and incumbents just couldn't survive that wave. And maybe Biden should have dropped out a year earlier. Maybe they should have had a primary process. Maybe they could have run harder on anti-woke issues. But maybe that wouldn't have made any difference. It's possible that this anti-incumbent wave that went right around the world, in those 10 major elections around the world, not a single incumbent leader survived it. And I don't think that should let Democrats off the hook, but it might give them some context in which to start this exploration of what should come next.
Jim VandeHei, I want to go back to something Derek Johnson, the head of the NAACP, said a few minutes ago on this show, because you've always been sort of the leading edge of where media is going with Politico, now with Axios. You understand the environment so well. How do Democrats, and frankly, how does legacy media need to change the way it thinks about getting information? I mean, a lot of the voters who went out and voted for Donald Trump, that so many people are wondering what happened here, they're not watching, frankly, this show. They're not reading the New York Times. They're not consuming media that way. And the Trump campaign found those voters where they live. So how do Democrats need to change the way they communicate to voters, if you think that's part of the problem?
For sure. I mean, I think all of us have to come to grips with legacy media is just not as important as it thinks it is. It is to you, it is to me. That's a relatively small group of people who rely on us for their information. And you have to go into the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. And basically, the way people get information has shattered into 20, 30 different pieces. And so if you just look empirically at the numbers, Joe Rogan's more important than any of us. He just has a much bigger, hyper-connected audience that listens to his every word. So maybe listen to Joe Rogan and kind of understand, like, what is he talking about? What are the guests that he has on? What are the issues that they care about? Realize that the gravity of right-wing discourse is now taking place on X. It's not Fox. X is what matters. Elon Musk is now, I wrote about this yesterday, arguably the most powerful civilian in the history of the country. He controls information flow. He controls multiple businesses. He has the president's ear. He's going to be in charge of some newfangled organization to gut government spending. We've not seen a person with that kind of clout across those sectors. But where his real power comes from is X. People thought he was an idiot when he bought X because he lost a lot of money. He's got a lot of money. And now he happens to have the most powerful platform on the right, and politics is downstream from information. And there's just a whole new information ecosystem out there. So for us, for you, for Democrats, for Republicans, you have to understand that you now are going to have to basically navigate 20 or 30 different parts of the ecosystem if you want to connect with the American people who vote.
So, Anna, there's a word that's come up a couple times on this show, but was not spoken much of at all during the campaign, which is COVID. And I do think that there is a sense that we're still dealing, perhaps, with the impact of that in a quiet way where it's not being discussed. The isolation, being in the lockdowns, people, particularly young men, who didn't get to go to high school, didn't go to their graduation, had to do everything through a screen, finding social media, becoming more isolated, becoming more angry. I'm just curious your thoughts. I know this is the kind of stuff that you spend time thinking about. Like, I think the ripple effects from what we all experienced those years, but particularly some groups, we're going to feel in our politics for a long time.
You know, when one person has a traumatic experience, we know what to do. They go to a counselor, a therapist, maybe they take some medication. When an entire country has a traumatic experience, it's just called life, right? It's just called history. And we had an entire country and world that had a traumatic experience, whether it was my kindergartner wearing a mask to school, which I'm very glad we had masks, but also watching my kindergartner not be able to recognize the faces of their best friend because eyes are not enough at age 6 to recognize a face. And the enormous amount of mental health challenges that I don't think we even fully realized were unleashed. The sense of defenselessness people felt economically. And you're right that when you have that kind of traumatic event, it's just in the blood in ways that historians may make sense of, sociologists may make sense of, but I don't think we right now are in a position to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And again, we look at results like this. I think a lot of what Jim is saying makes a lot of sense, but we look at these things in terms of parties competing and what are the quality of these parties. But the real drama is always what's going on with people, right? And what this is really proof of is not one party being more defunct than another. I mean, that, at the margin, that's true. But this is just a biopsy of what's going on with us right now. And what I take from it, from my political vantage point, is that we're not okay. And that a lot of people are grasping for things. My most empathetic read of some of this drift towards Trump is that a lot of people are grasping for a story, a source of meaning, a way of explaining what they're feeling, what their life has been like to themselves, that is different from the stories they've tried before. And that is very understandable against the backdrop of what people have lived through. And if you are then going back to that question of what can Democrats do, it is not just tactical or policy. It is really building a movement that is a home for people who feel that loneliness and alienation of young men, of white people who want to be good people in a pluralist country but don't quite know how to talk, how to be, of people who feel these job losses, feel deindustrialization, but also want the better angels to come out and not be sniping at a border and migrants just because the car industry is not doing well. But you have to really build a movement that walks people through an age instead of just offering them a menu of policies.
But don't you also, Anna, have to build a movement with people that understand people? Isn't culture part of a large part of this? That people feel that the leaders that are talking for them talk to them and understand them, and that goes across party lines. What Donald Trump was able to do, and I think fabricated, but he was able to do, is make people feel like I understand you. I'm mad too. I'm angry too. I deal with the resentment you do. And people keyed into the resentment, fabricated or not, more than policy, because they were mad. And they wanted somebody to say, you're not crazy to feel mad. There is things that are not working for you. And that's cultural as well as understanding the feeling of people. You know, I was close with James Brown growing up. James Brown used to tell me, Reverend, people can feel you before they hear you. And I think that that's the kind of political leadership the Democrats are going to have to try to find.
I desperately agree with that. I mean, you're a man of the church. You understand, like, even when a church leader asks people to vote a certain way, that is the end of a very long process. And it began with some muffins in a basement. Right. It began with hugging someone when they lost someone.
Right. Fried chicken in our basement, but go ahead.
But years. That's and
right.
Maybe at the end of those years of building trust, building connection, being there for people in a bad moment, tolerating them when they believe the wrong things, at the end of that funnel, maybe you can say, hey, I'd like you to think about voting for this person.
Okay, but Donald Trump did none of that,
right.
FYI.
Well, no, I don't agree. Particularly the media ecosystem it's not a good one, it's a negative one, it's a radicalization funnel. But what they have done in their online media ecosystem is build a radicalization engine, literally the way militant groups do around the world, that takes people from relatively low-level annoyances with the world. Why are eggs so expensive? Why is my kid learning this new thing in American history in school that I didn't learn? And then moves them through YouTube videos, through podcasts, moves them from that annoyance all the way, slowly, to a full-blown fascist politics. It's an elaborate, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, and there is nothing like it on the pro-democracy side. We don't have when a man is just lost and lonely and not yet radicalized, we don't have the equivalent of Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson to move that man in a feminist direction. By the way, we should educate men that it's actually really great to live with a strong woman who makes money. It's actually easier. Life is easier.
But I think Mika's right. Donald Trump didn't do any of that, but he played on the resentment of those that did. And I think that's got to be dealt with.
It is. But I think we can't entirely blame one person.
No.
We have not built. This is an era around the world. I just came back. I was actually in India on Election Day for my grandfather's 100th birthday. India has an authoritarian leader also, very similar to Donald Trump, Narendra Modi. The issues are different. It's not a history of slavery or white supremacy. It's a different set of issues. But the feeling is the same in India, right? And again, in India, there has been a movement to take people from why is this happening to into this politics. And the center-left movement in India just has none of that. It doesn't have explanations for it. It doesn't have a leader. By the way, to Jim's point, I think that the Democratic National Committee chair has always been a kind of low-level sideshow job. Maybe in this era of Democrats in the wilderness, maybe that should be a really important job. Maybe it should go to a really dynamic, extraordinary person who can actually lead these reckonings, facilitate these conversations, be trusted by progressives and moderates, and actually have this conversation, think about the media infrastructure we need to build. This is a generational project, and I hope it's not just, did she tack too far to the left, did she tack too far to the center?
I hear you on that completely.
It's a big generational and frankly exciting question.
Yeah, Joe, jump in.
Yeah, Rev, I want to talk to you because there's been an awful lot of talk about people who have traditionally voted for Democrats, black men, Hispanic men, moving away because they believe that men have not been welcomed into the new Democratic Party, and that somehow there's something wrong with being a man, that there is a collective guilt. We've heard it time and time again. Again, if anybody's listening to this, or anybody in the Democratic Party is listening to this, and they're like shocked by those words, then they've had their head in the sand for about 5, 6, 7 years. But we hear it all the time. You know, Willie and I have talked about it. Children going to schools. We've had writers from the Atlantic talking about it, coming on about articles they've read about their children going to school in Manhattan. And young boys, 7, 8, 9-year-old boys, being told that they're part of a collective guilt because they are a male. Toxic masculinity starts at 7. And, that doesn't work. Not only does that not work in politics, that doesn't work in society. So while Democrats are sitting here talking, trying to figure out what's happened with men, why black men, why Hispanic men are departing the Democratic Party, they have to look back and see what's happened over the past 10 years in the Democratic Party and among progressive elites, and this feeling, whether it's in an elementary school or whether it's on college campuses, that this collective guilt against men, the charge that all men are somehow part of this toxic masculinity, that's how parties lose men. That's how men fall to the side. That's why black men and Hispanic men, in many cases, said, enough. I'm going to vote for the other guy.
And I think that the bottom line of what you're saying is that many of the young black men I talk to in my own organization and those that are not are saying they did not feel they left the Democratic Party. They feel the Democratic Party in some ways left them and don't understand them and don't relate to the fact that they're not part of a toxic masculinity, but they want to be able to be what they are. And I remember I was making a speech somewhere, and I talked about how we must support our women, like I talked about some today, but we also show our real manhood by doing that. We were raised, many of us in the black community, by single mothers. My father left when I was 10. My mother used to tell me to put on cologne so they wouldn't smell the roach spray we had to spray in the tenement we lived in. And Rachel Nordling, who's probably one of the most influential black women in the country, told me, you need to talk about that more, how you embrace your single mother, but at the same time wanted to grow up and be a man and emulated those men. And I think that the party went to where they were perceived by some of the men like, you don't understand me.
All right.